I was a resident in pediatrics at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh in the late 1970s, and at that time we would every week as interns and residents see children who would come into the hospital infected with a bacterium called Haemophilus influenza type B, or HIV. It was an incredibly common cause of meningitis, which is an inflammation of the lining and brain and spinal cord. It was a common cause of sepsis, which is to say bloodstream infection, and it was a common cause of something called epiglottitis, when the epiglottis, the tissue that sits on top of the windpipe, would swell up and cause suffocation. We saw it every week. It was our life, frankly, as interns and residents then, in the late 70s. By the late 1980s, a vaccine was developed to protect against Haemophilus influenza type B, and which dramatically reduced the incidence of the disease. This was a disease that affected 20 to 25,000 children every year, killing many and leaving others permanently with permanent brain damage or kidney damage and other sequelae. So after that vaccine was introduced, we went from about 20 to 25,000 cases a year to fewer than 10 cases a year, up until recently. There was just to put this in perspective, about a year ago, we had a child admitted to our hospital who had bacterial meningitis and died from the disease. Every Monday, we have our weekly infectious disease conferences where fellows from our division come and listen to our presentations and make the presentations. When we presented that case of bacterial meningitis, we asked them to go through the differential diagnosis of what bacteria or viruses could have caused that. None of them listed Haemophilus influenza type B. They'd never seen it before, even though that is what this child had, and that is what killed this child. And this child was one of several children who in the Philadelphia area, 3 specifically, that died of invasive Haemophilus influenza B disease. Died because the parents actually were more frightened of the vaccine than they were of the disease it prevented. I think it's a testament actually to how successful we've been with that vaccine, that these residents or these fellows that bacteria didn't even come to mind. But this isn't the outbreaks of Haemophilus influenza type B, which have occurred not only in the Philadelphia area, but also in Minnesota and in a couple other states. It's not unique to that bacteria because there have been other outbreaks. So, for example, we had a measles epidemic in the United States in 2008 that was bigger than anything we'd had in more than a decade. We've had a mumps epidemics, as you know, in New York and New Jersey. They've involved about 1,500 people, leaving several people deaf. We've had pertussis or whooping cough outbreaks in California. We have one now that's involved more than 9,000 people, caused 10 young babies to die. That is the biggest outbreak we've seen of whooping cough in California since 1947. So why is that? Why is it that we've come to fear vaccines to the level that we now have outbreaks of infectious diseases, that we've come to see this life-saving medical product as something to be feared rather than embraced? And I argue in this book that I think the birth of the American anti-vaccine movement occurred on one specific day, and I think that day was April 19th, 1982, because on that day there was a one-hour television documentary. It aired on WRC TV4 in Washington, D.C., which was an NBC affiliate. It was called DPT Vaccine Roulette. DPT stands for the vaccine diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus. And the show was dramatic. I mean, it was, I don't know if any of you remember Frederick Wiseman, who was a documentary filmmaker in the 1960s and 70s, made such famous films as Titicut Follies and others. But it had that quality. It was the stories were one of parents, and they were all the same. The parents told the story, my child was fine, they got this vaccine, and now look what's happened. And you would see very up close these children who had mental retardation, who had permanent seizure disorders, epilepsy, who had withered spastic limbs, who were wearing bicycle helmets, who were seizing, who were looking vacantly up into space. It was dramatic. It was like a sort of a Richard Avedon film or picture, in that you were far too intimately involved with the pictures of those children than you could stand. I mean, it was really very emotional and gripping, and it had an effect. There were a few people in the Northern Virginia or Washington, D.C. area that day, including Barbara Loe Fisher, Kathy Williams, and Jeff Schwartz, who got together through that local NBC affiliate, who sort of got people who called the show in to get together. together. And they very quickly, within a couple weeks, formed a group called Dissatisfied Parents Together, or DPT. That group, by the early 1990s, had changed their name to the National Vaccine Information Center, of which Barbara Loe Fisher was the head. This group was powerful enough and connected enough early on that within 1 month of that show's airing, there was a congressional hearing headed by Paula Hawkins, who's since deceased, but she was a Republican senator from Florida, who was looking into whether or not vaccines, in fact, were doing more harm than good. The result was predictable. There was a flood of litigation claiming that vaccines not only caused epilepsy or mental retardation, but also caused unexplained coma, sudden infant death syndrome, and other illnesses, to the point that there were hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and awards, and companies were largely abandoning the business. We went from 6 measles-containing measles vaccine makers to 1. We went from 3 oral polio vaccine makers to 1, and we went from 8 whooping cough or pertussis vaccine makers to 1. We were really on the verge of losing vaccines for American children. And so what happened in 1986 is that the government stepped in and created something called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which basically created the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program to put up a wall between the parent and the pharmaceutical company. You had to first go through this federal claims court before you could actually sue a pharmaceutical company in open court. But it had an effect. We went from 27 vaccine makers in 1955 to 18 vaccine makers in 1980 to basically 5 vaccine makers today. So although I think that the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act saved vaccines, that event that occurred in the early 1980s was a tremendous hit. What's interesting about that to me is that at the time, and John Stossel remembers this well, he covered the story, we didn't have the science to go up against the contention. The fear was that the pertussis vaccine caused permanent brain damage, but there wasn't in hand the epidemiological studies looking at hundreds of thousands of children who did or didn't receive that vaccine to see whether the incidence of permanent brain damage was greater in the vaccinated group. It took really 10 years for that science to mature, and by the time it matured, then we now know that the vaccine never caused permanent brain damage. Of interest to me was it took another 15 years to figure out what really was happening. Basically in 2006, so it's almost 25 years after that event, after that television show, you now had in hand the kind of genetic probes to allow you to look at those children to see what really was the cause of epilepsy and retardation. And that work was done by Sam Berkovic at the University of Melbourne, where he went back to look at those children now in their 30s and 40s to see what was going on. And he found that almost all of them had something called an SCN1A mutation, which is to say a sodium channel transport defect. This is a genetic mutation which has 100% penetrance. All of these children will develop a mental retardation or epilepsy, independent, obviously, of whether they receive vaccines. Vaccines don't cause the genetic malformation. That work was published in 2006 and got absolutely no media attention. I mean, when you think about the media attention that was accorded DPT vaccine roulette in magazines, newspapers, television shows, it was on the Today's Show, it was on 2020. Now, fast forward 25 years to where you really have the answer to the question that was raised by that show, and not a single journalist covered that story. Remarkable. What's happened, though, is that the Dissatisfied Parents Together, when they became the National Vaccine Information Center, really became the one-stop shop to scare parents about vaccines. And every time a new vaccine was introduced onto the market, the National Vaccine Information Center was there. When the Hib vaccine was first introduced in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was Barbara Loe Fisher on ABC's World News Tonight claiming that the Hib vaccine caused diabetes. The vaccine doesn't cause diabetes. When the hepatitis B vaccine was first introduced, there again, was Barbara Loe Fisher on World News Tonight claiming that the vaccine caused sudden infant death syndrome or multiple sclerosis. There was actually a 2020 piece, and you can actually see Barbara Loe Fisher on the B-roll, so she was clearly giving advice there, making the claim that this vaccine was causing permanent harm. And these were very emotional shows. That hepatitis B vaccine show on 2020, and this was when Hugh Downs and Barbara Walters were the hosts, showed a mother who had given her child the second dose of hepatitis B, and the child had, within about a day of that, passed away from sudden infant death syndrome. And the mother, said, this is, my child was fine, and now this vaccine killed her. And then they showed the tombstone, with the inscription, "Our little angel." And I think anybody who's human is going to be moved by this and feel that maybe this is a vaccine that should be avoided, even though we now clearly know that the hepatitis B vaccine doesn't cause sudden infant death syndrome. But like all vaccines, the hepatitis B vaccine is only designed to prevent one specific